Hello, everyone. Let's begin this module, and we'll talk about cooperative learning in this module. This is one of the many modules that you're going to have, I think 4 in all this semester. And we're going to talk about learning not from an individual level, not at an individual level, but at the level of groups, of dyads, and so on. Right? Cooperative learning is this theory about how learning is accelerated when groups of students work together. So the learning objectives for today are to understand what cooperative learning means, to articulate its benefits, and to also understand and articulate the conditions for cooperative learning to be successful. Using these skills, you will analyze cooperative learning scenarios for their essential sort of active ingredients, what it really makes them work, what I call here the working mechanism. Um, then doing so will allow you to assess whether cooperative learning will be successful in that scenario and to adapt cooperative learning scenarios to make them more successful, right? So this is sort of the end objective of all of these building blocks, right? So without much further ado, I want to get started, but before I do, I think it would be useful to have some kind of common ground about what cooperative learning actually is. So we'll start with the definition, which seems very simple on the surface. Cooperative learning is students working together to accomplish shared learning goals. And while it seems trivial, this is actually a rather nuanced definition. Um, and I want to break it down into its components so we make sure that we are all on the same page. So first of all, this is about working together. If students are not working together, even though it seems like they are cooperating, then it isn't cooperative learning. For example, if you are borrowing class notes from someone who took this class last year, and you're building on those class notes, then you and the student from last year are not working together. So it wouldn't really be cooperative learning. The second thing is that students should be working together towards a learning goal. And so this is specifically not a goal for making things, right? So this isn't a production goal. So for example, if you take a project and you split it up into 4 parts, each person does one part, and then you pull it all together, then you have shared goals, which is to finish the project, but you don't have shared learning goals because you're not together trying to learn something. So a shared learning goal is essential for cooperative learning. I keep saying shared learning goal, and that I also want to highlight. The sharedness means that everyone has the same goal. If you and a teammate are both trying to learn something from this exercise, but you're trying to learn different things, then you wouldn't be engaged in a cooperative learning activity. So now that we have broken down this definition, pause for a moment to think about all of the learning activities that seem cooperative, but may not be cooperative. Once you're done, you can restart this video. Okay, so hopefully you've thought about a few activities which aren't cooperative learning. Here are a couple that I found. One is sort of the obvious thing, a standard lecture style classroom where an instructor is talking and you're listening to him individually or her individually. That isn't cooperative learning, it is individual work, right? So this is one example. Another example would be individual tutoring, where you have one tutor who is teaching one student. This looks like a cooperative learning exercise because there's 2 people and they're working towards seemingly a shared goal, but only the learner has a learning goal, and the tutor does not have a learning goal in this tutoring exercise. Right. So in this case, this would not be cooperative learning either. Now, you can think of another example where you may be reading a paper and explaining it to a friend who, let's say, wasn't able to understand it by themselves. But in this case, even though it feels like you're working together to accomplish a shared learning goal, the learning goal isn't shared. The goal for you is to explain, and the goal for your friend is to understand. Um, As you can see, these are not the same. So this is also not an example of cooperative learning. So what are examples of cooperative learning? We looked at a few in the past few modules. For example, we looked at peer instruction, where you have people who learners who answer a question individually in a classroom, and then they have a peer discussion trying to teach each other or clarify misconceptions for each other. In this case, they both have the same learning goal, which is to learn whatever is being taught in class, and they're working together. So this would be an example of a cooperative learning activity. Similarly, unlike expert tutoring, peer tutoring is an example of learning which is cooperative. In peer tutoring, both the learners are trying to learn and both are trying to help each other. And the learning goals are the same: to learn and to learn, right? It isn't to learn and to teach. So in this case, you're working together, you're both trying to understand something and you're helping each other out. Definitely a cooperative learning exercise with a shared learning goal where students are working together. Great. So now that we've looked at a few idealized examples, let's look at a few realistic examples that you may have seen of cooperative learning. There's a couple. There's a dreaded group assignment where one person does all the work and everybody else uses that person's work to get a grade. There's sort of this dreaded group discussion where, everybody's awkward and no one speaks up. Or there is this ill-conceived project competition, which people call cooperative, but really it isn't even cooperative learning because there's no shared learning goal, right? And even if there is a shared learning goal, well, students are not working together, right? So they're working individually to compete. There are other learning communities which are often vague in what they mean by cooperative learning. And some of them are cooperative learning and some of them aren't. We'll discuss some of these learning communities in class so that you can analyze whether or not they are actually cooperative learning communities. A lot of these negative examples, which I think we've all learned to hate, group assignments or group discussions. But hopefully you've also seen those rare, well-designed activities, maybe from grade school that you still remember, that were great at cooperative learning. Hopefully you had that privilege. If not, hopefully you'll allow other students to have that privilege. The way to do it is to understand how to design cooperative learning correctly. And that's what the rest of this module is going to talk about. What happens when you do design cooperative learning correctly? Here are some common goals for cooperative learning. The first is student achievement. This is improved learning. This is this stuff like higher grades, being able to understand things that you're teaching in class. But there's also these other goals like empathy and inclusion, like helping students see the world from other students' perspective. One particular method, which is called the jigsaw method, talks about both inclusion and students' sense of belonging in the classroom. And we'll discuss that not this week, next week. This week, we are focused on student achievement. So designing cooperative learning well allows you to improve student achievement. How much does it improve by? It depends on the topic that you're teaching, and it depends on how well the cooperative learning is designed, but usually between 1.4 to 1.7 standard deviations above individual learning. And so this is a really large and significant difference. This 1.7 number, I think, comes from math using conversational assistance. So this would be conversational peer tutoring. So even in a subject like math, which seems like it's all full of facts and there's nothing to discuss, cooperative learning can improve the student achievement by about 1.7 of a standard deviation. Huge gains. Why does this happen? people have looked at this question at least since the 1960s. They have four main theories for why it works. We are not going to go into these theories in this module because they're actually, a lot of them are complementary and none of these theories are competing with each other. So what I want to do is to use the results from each of these theories to figure out how to implement cooperative learning effectively. But if you're interested, there's an optional reading which talks all about uh, cooperative learning theories and the historical perspective. But now I just want to provide an overview. There are four theories as to why cooperative learning helps improve student achievement. Two of these have to do with motivation. Students are more motivated to learn if you design cooperative learning effectively. Two of these are cognitive. Students think better in some sense, more effectively, if you are designing cooperative learning. The first of them says that students help each other because, well, we incentivize them to do so, right? And these incentives can be things like grades. Um, well, that seems like it should work. Um, there's the second theory that actually students are helping each other not just because of the grades, but because they like each other. And so in this case, the goal of designing cooperative learning is incentives. In this case, the second theory, the goal is to make students like each other, right? And if you succeed in this, then the theory goes, you should be able to help students learn better because they're going to help each other. So those are motivational theories. There's also this cognitive theory. When you're working in teams, you're going to elaborate your explanations. Just like I'm elaborating these explanations now, when you talk about them to a friend, it's not just you thinking about them, you're talking about them, and therefore they become more elaborate. By elaborating explanations, you understand them even better. So that's the cognitive theory. There's the last cognitive theory, which is you learn by listening to others. This is a very coarse and rough approximation of this theory. This is the cognitive development theory. While it is functionally true, the reason why listening to each other might help you think better is deep. So if you want to know more about this, I suggest reading the optional reading. It's on Canvas for this week. Unfortunately, we're not going to have the time to go into any of these theories in any depth. For now, what we're going to do is to look at the common goals that teachers have or educators have for the achievement end of these cooperative learning goals. Remember, cooperative learning can help with a lot of things, not just achievement. It could also be empathy and inclusion or sense of belonging. But this week, we're focusing on achievement. So, what are the common achievement goals that teachers and educators want to achieve? The first of them is almost a meta goal. It is to help students acquire the skills to cooperate effectively. We'll talk a little bit about these skills in a couple minutes. The second goal is to help students learn about a target concept. So, acquire skills is really learn about a target concept. And this could be a target concept like how does nuclear fusion work, right? Specifically, it is not about how cooperation works, right? So that would be, or how to cooperate better. That would be goal one. The last goal is to be able to use knowledge that you have acquired previously from a target concept for example, making something. And this would be like a project goal. Now, unfortunately, in the real world, goal 3 is often emphasized over goal 2, and goal 2 is often emphasized over goal 1. While we live in the real world, I also want to, and there are reasons why this happens with the structure of our schools. As a learning engineer, you should understand that this is detrimental. It is far better to focus on goal 1 and 2, especially in grades 1 through 8, where students can learn how to cooperate effectively and those skills will help them achieve goal 3 as they grow older. Fortunately, right now, we have this backwards, and goal 3 is overemphasized while goal 1 is underemphasized. Why is goal 1 so really important? Because goal 1 feeds into goal 2 and it feeds into goal 3. Unless you know how to cooperate effectively, you can't use cooperative learning to learn skills, nor can you use the knowledge in a cooperative fashion. All right, so we have talked about goal 1 to acquire skills for cooperation. What does those skills look like? Here are a few examples. A couple skills that students need in order to cooperate successfully are sharing resources and often ideas, to actively listen to each other. Remember, listening is one of the main benefits, or improved listening through improved learning through listening is one of the theories for why cooperative learning works. There's also commenting constructively on other people's ideas. And by that, I mean building on each other's ideas and doing so rationally with justification for actions. Continuing on this responsibility and justification angle, learning to accept responsibility for one's individual actions is also a core skill to cooperate successfully. And there's some new research. This is from 2009, so barely a decade old compared to these other ideas were established in the 60s, that when you're working together in a small team, you're often making decisions democratically, and making such decisions democratically spills over to other fields as well. So, making such decisions democratically is not just useful for successfully cooperating on a team, but it may also be useful for successfully cooperating as a city or a community. All right, so now that we've seen these skills, I want to give a quick overview of what we're going to look at in order to design activities for successful cooperative learning. And to do that, we're going to go backwards. We're going to look at what cooperative learning groups look like, what the results are, and then we're going to design for these results. So cooperative learning groups, which work well, are characterized by these three, let's call them symptoms, right? But they're really processes that individuals in that group engage in. The first is positive interdependence. We'll talk a little bit about what positive interdependence means, but roughly speaking, it is that students who work in the team help each other learn. The second process that you see is individual accountability. And this is related. It is that when learning is assessed, students are assessed for how well they individually contributed to their team's learning. And finally, we've talked all about these great within team interactions like sharing resources and actively listening. And that would be the third thing over here, a great within team interaction. Okay, so I talked about positive interdependence at a higher level. What does it really mean? Positive interdependence is this idea that learners can depend on each other to achieve the learning objective. There are two parts to it, both of which are important. First, it must be positive. So students must help, not hurt, nor ignore others' learning. So a competition would be ignoring others' learning because you're competing with them. Misconceptions would be hurting each other's learning. So if learners are spreading misconceptions, or if they're ignoring each other's learning, you don't have the positive part of this interaction. The interdependence part is that all learners are both receiving and giving, right? So all learners both give and take. If you have one learner who's only getting help from other people, but is not contributing effectively, then you don't have interdependence. On the other hand, if you have a learner who's already mastered that material, and so he really doesn't need anybody's help, he's not interdependent or she's not interdependent on anyone else either. So you need both positiveness and interdependence. And so we put them together in this phrase called positive interdependence. Positive interdependence is essential for cooperative learning. Okay, I've talked about positive interdependence and how it has two parts and how it is essential. I must clarify now that it refers exclusively to the learning goal, not to the production goal, right? So a positive interdependence, for example, will not refer to work in a project that is being split such that you'll put things together at the end. So if you had a team of 3 people, and you had a project to make a website, and then you have one person who codes, one person who designs, and one person who thinks about learning and engineers it, then this would be a team which is a production team, not a learning goal team, right? And in that case, this would not have positive interdependence because everybody is just splitting up the work and they're not trying to help each other learn, right? So simply making things on a team does not mean you'll learn from it. To have positive interdependence, you must have a learning goal. Having such a learning goal and having positive interdependence improves the interaction within the team, and it also promotes individuals to take accountability for their actions to help them help the team learn. So that's the last part here about promoting individual accountability. I want to go into individual accountability in a little more detail now. And what do we really mean by accountability, right? So accountability here means that, or individual accountability here means that each individual is accountable for their actions in the team. Now, this isn't saying that each individual is accountable for their own learning on the team, and therefore it isn't about whether or not they achieve the learning objective, right? It is instead about whether they took individual action to help their team achieve the learning objective. Help the team is what they are being held accountable for. Okay, so if you have a student on a team who takes accountability for their own learning and says, oh, none of my teammates are helping me learn, I'm going to be accountable for my own learning, and learns individually, that wouldn't be individual accountability. Instead, if you want individual accountability, you would want to see everybody in the team saying, I am individually responsible for helping my team learn a particular part of this concept that they are learning. All of this will hopefully become clear in the next couple things that we look at, which are cases for what cooperative learning looks like. But before I go there, here's a quick check to make sure that we are following through on our learning objectives. We've learned what cooperative learning is. It is that students work together to accomplish shared learning goals. We articulated its benefits, which could improve learning, but also improve empathy, sense of belonging, and other social goals. This week, we are only looking at improved learning. We articulated what are the conditions for cooperative learning to be successful, and there are two: individual accountability and positive interdependence. Now we're going to analyze a couple situations. So we are over here. We're going to analyze a couple situations for ferreting out whether or not those situations are cooperative learning, whether they have all of these ingredients, and whether they will be successful. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that now. To do that, here is the first model that we are going to look at. Here's a teacher who divides her class into teams of 5 students. Each student in a team of 5 is assigned to one of 5 learning modules in a textbook. So, for example, let's say that they are learning about the history of Rome. Maybe someone will have a module like the government of Rome. Another may have a module about the rise of the empire, and so on and so forth, right? So you'll have 5 of these modules. Now, each student is assigned one module, like the rise of the empire. They go off, learn the module, then they take the test as a team, and there's one question per module on that test, right? So they turn in one quiz as a team, and by quiz I really mean test here, right? So in fact, let's change this to a quiz. Okay, they take a quiz together, they turn in the quiz together, and at the end of it, the grades for everybody on the team are the same. That is the grades of whatever they turned in as a quiz. Now, is this cooperative learning at all? Pause this video here and answer yes or no, and then continue watching. Okay, hopefully you've decided whether this is or it isn't cooperative learning. I will argue here that, in fact, this is not cooperative learning, because what's happening here is that students are learning a module, but they're not required to help other people on the team learn the module, right? So they aren't working together really to learn. They are working together to take the test, but they're not working together to learn. So this isn't cooperative learning because no, not group, but common, it does not have common learning goals. So this isn't cooperative learning at all. Now let's move on to a different version of this and analyze it again. In this case, you have the teacher who does the same thing, divides his class into groups of 5. Each individual is assigned one of 5 learning modules. Now, here's the thing. Students learn the module, but this time they're explicitly required to teach each other what they have learned. Similarly as before, they turn in one quiz as a team, and the grades for each student is the score corresponding to their own module in the quiz. Now, for a moment, ignore whether or not they're going to actually engage in teaching each other. This, we acknowledge, is kind of difficult to enforce. But let's say that that does happen. The question here is there positive interdependence on this team? Will students actually help each other learn given how they're being graded? So the grade for each student here is a score corresponding to their own module on the quiz. So now analyze this and say, is there positive interdependence here? Pause this video and make up your mind. Okay, hopefully you have a guess. And now I'm going to argue that actually there is no positive interdependence in this case, because the grade for each student is a score corresponding to their own module. If that is the case, the student has no incentive to teach other people that module because they can just write that answer on the quiz. Remember, they're just turning in one quiz as a team. So there is no positive interdependence here, right? One quiz and own module together means no positive interdependence. Okay, let's do one more where we look at positive interdependence. This teacher, again, divides the class into groups of 5. Each individual is assigned to one of 5 modules. Students learn the module, they teach each other what they've learned, and they turn in the quiz as a team. This time, the grades for each student are the same regardless of what module they picked, right? So the students turn in one quiz as a team, and everybody gets the same grade. Pause this video, think about, is there positive interdependence in this case? hopefully you have a guess. Again, in this case, there is no positive interdependence because learners will do more or less exactly the same thing that they did in the previous case. They'll be able to fill out the quiz and take in, they may just write their own answer. Then you have no positive interdependence. They're not required to teach anyone else what they have learned. Okay, now let's move on. And in this case, I'm going to say that there is actually, let me give you half the answer. There is positive interdependence in this condition. I want us to analyze if there's individual accountability. Okay. So in this case, the teacher divides the class into two teams of 5. Each team is assigned one of 5 modules. Students learn the module, teach each other. Here's the difference. They turn in 1 quiz per student. And the grade for each student is the average score of everybody else on the team. In this case, first of all, let's establish that there is positive interdependence. So if you are a student who has learned module 1 and you have another student who's learned module 2, you have a quiz which has both 1 and 2 on it, right? So you have a quiz which looks at both learning modules. So you need 2's help in order to answer this question. Similarly, you who have learned module 2, you need the first student's help in order to answer this question, right? So if you want to do well on your quiz, you need each other's help. And so if we just stopped here and said, everybody turns in 1 quiz per student and everybody is graded on their own quiz, there's already positive interdependence. But we've changed that a little bit more. And now we're going to say that the grades for each student is the average score for everybody on the team, right? So now analyze whether this has individual accountability. Pause the video and make your own hypothesis. Okay, now hopefully you have a guess about whether this has individual accountability or not. And so here's how you can tell about the individual accountability. The grade for each student is not their own grade, right? It is the grade of everybody in the team. So they are being held accountable for improving other scores, right? So they are being accountable for improving a different student's score. And this is the way the grades are in this class. So because they're accountable for improving someone else's score or measure of learning, they are accountable for improving someone else's learning. And so this is an individual accountability for the team learning. And in this case, this is one of those rare cases where it is cooperative learning, well designed to have both individual accountability and to have positive interdependence. I would suggest pausing this video here and noting what parts of this design make it both useful for individual accountability and for positive interdependence. Once you've done that, then move on to the next slide where we'll talk more about, well, how to be successful at cooperative learning. And we've talked about rewards. We've talked about grades, but they're really just generally rewards. And these rewards should combine the group success, which is, and the individual contributions. And really this is, they should combine, I'll edit it right now to say they should combine positive interdependence and individual accountability. Great. So I call this a required thing because a lot of research has shown that unless you actually have grades which reward both positive interdependence and individual accountability, it is very difficult to have successful cooperative learning. So this we call required. Um, and hopefully this module has helped you figure out how to actually implement rewards which both combine positive interdependence and individual accountability. There's a couple bonus points. You can improve successful cooperative learning by creating these norms of interaction, and these reward positive behavior through a norm. This point we will discuss next week, and we'll also discuss next week how to design tasks such that there is interdependence built in into the learning task. For now, I want to leave you with two questions which are really FAQs for cooperative learning. I've gotten them from many students over the years. And the first of them is how many people? How many people should you have in a team or in a group? And the answer is, of course, it depends. There are learning methods which use two people, right? Peer tutoring, for example, you can have just two people and it works well. But speaking generally and on average, 3 or 4 people works best for cooperative learning. In particular, it works better than 6 or 7 people. With more people, what tends to happen is that there are two problems. One is what we call social loafing. This is the idea that students stop contributing because they assume someone else will, right? So you have essentially people assuming that someone else will pick up the slack. So there's social loafing. Social loafing gets worse with larger groups. So 3 or 4 is sort of the Goldilocks number. Second is that people haven't developed cooperative skills, which we talked about before, especially in grade 1 through 8. We want to develop these cooperative skills, but right now we haven't done a great job of that. So people lack cooperative skills, and because of that, the larger the group, the harder it is to cooperate. So again, smaller groups work well. So 3 to 4 is sort of the Goldilocks zone. In this place, most cooperative learning methods work well. Some may need fewer people, but rarely does a learning method work well when you have more than 6 or 7 people cooperating. That's question one. The other question, and this is the last thing that I'll leave you with, is what happens when you have competing groups? So often there's this idea that, hey, why don't we combine the benefits of cooperation and the benefits of competition? Let's split the classroom into groups of students, and each group as a group will compete against other groups, right? It sounds like a good idea, and in fact, it has no real downsides. The only thing is that it has the same learning benefits for the most part as non-competing groups. Again, I'm speaking broadly. There are cases where competing groups do have benefits. But for the most part, if you remove the competition between groups, they would be just as effective as if you made them compete with each other. So from a learning engineering point of view, it's easier to design learning activities where there is no intergroup competition. So you may make your job a little bit easier by not including competition within groups. It doesn't hurt, but it doesn't help very much either. So that's the end of this module. In class, we'll look at a few examples of cooperative learning systems. But for now, go back to the learning objectives and make sure that you have actually managed to achieve all of them. In class, we will assume that you have, and we'll analyze a bunch of situations to look at cooperative learning in real life systems.